The concept of the Dreadnought is most commonly associated today with the loyalist Adeptus Astartes. These creations are as much tomb as they are war machine, a means for a fallen warrior to fight on even beyond the point of their expected death. However, the Space Marines are not the only ones to utilize Dreadnoughts in their arsenal. Heck, they may not have even been the first to create them within the Imperium of Man. We looked at the loyal Astartes Dreadnoughts in a recent log, but there are a vast array across the galaxy's other factions, so let's take the time to dive into them and see how everyone else goes about it with their own versions. We'll be looking at other Imperial groups, as well as Chaos and even Xenos too, so we've plenty to get on with. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. We discussed the fundamentals of Dreadnoughts and their creation last time, and whilst there is variance from faction to faction, the core concepts are still broadly the same, so I won't repeat them here. Probably the easiest jumping off point, therefore, is to look at a faction who uses broadly the same Dreadnoughts as the Space Marines, but without the added complication of mutation or warp chicanery. That being the Legio Custodes, or the Adeptus Custodes, the name changed after the Horus Heresy, give or take. The Custodes were among the original creations of the Emperor as concerns genetically modified warriors, certainly older than the Astartes, and whilst the two groups are very different by design, they do share some common war gear and ideas. As a result, I would hazard a guess that the Custodians were the first users of Dreadnought technology, a means of preserving those whose immortal longevity had been almost cut short on the battlefield. I can't prove they had them before Space Marines with dates or anything like that, but it would make sense given they're the older faction. Those few Custodians who were interred into Dreadnoughts were known as the Moritoi, or the Honoured Dead Who Walked. Not sure if that's a direct translation from High Gothic, or just another moniker given to them. They formed the smallest subdivision within the Legio Custodes, perhaps unsurprisingly. The Custodes exclusively used and continue to use Contemptor pattern Dreadnoughts for the Moritoi. You don't see many of these nowadays in Astartes forces, as they're poorly understood by the Mechanicus and in many ways more advanced than the modern Castiferum patterns. But it was the standard Great Crusade era variant, so I'm unsurprised to see it with the Custodes too. Unfortunately, this doesn't prove or disprove anything as to whether the Custodes were using Dreadnoughts first, since both they and the Astartes used them on the regular. But regardless of that, they weren't content to simply use the standard prime pattern that you would see with Space Marines. There are two variants of Contemptor that are, I believe, completely unique to the Custodes, and both better reflect the armament of their still living brothers far better than the classic ones do. They are the Contemptor Galatus and the Contemptor Achilles, both marked improvements on the original, with equipment supposedly crafted personally by the artificers of the Imperial Court. The Achilles, or Achilles I suppose, was the more common of the two, at least at the time of the Horus Heresy, combining the martial skill of its custodian pilot with the speed and power of the engine. It is armed with a weapon known as the Dread Spear, an enlarged variant of the iconic custodian weapon, the Guardian Spear. Presumably the choice therefore to inter a custodian into a Galatus or an Achilles would be based on their weapon preference if they had the option. And just like the Guardian Spear that inspired it, the Dread Spear incorporates a powerful ranged weapon into the haft, in this case a Corvée las pulsar supplemented by a pair of wrist-mounted guns as well. The use of the spear means that, barring the Galatus, which we'll get to, and I believe a modern Space Wolf Castiferum variant, the Achilles is pretty much the only Dreadnought to use a weapon held in its hand, as opposed to having a weapon built into the arm like you'd see with pretty much every Castiferum. And speaking of the Galatus, this variant is probably one of the tankiest Dreadnoughts out there. Not only is it more heavily armoured than a standard Contemptor, but it also carries a massive Praesidium shield, the precursor to Storm Shield, which has smaller versions carried by Custodian infantry, and even Refractor Field should it lose the one it's carrying for an added layer of defence. But the Galatus isn't just about defence, far from it in fact, it just needs to get up close to do any damage with its huge Galatus Warblade with inbuilt Infernus Incinerator. Yes, it's a sword with a flamethrower in it. That's cool. As far as custodian dreadnoughts go, I think it only fair in terms of famous ones to discuss the first of them all, the first ever custodian to die as a matter of fact, if records are to be believed. His name, or at least his original one since custodians earn more names as they go, was Sagittarius Malak, one of the first 30 custodians ever believed created and who had served alongside the Emperor in the Unification Wars on Terra. He was present for the first battle of the Thunder Warriors, the Battle of Moorland Sen in the Nordic region of Terra, with the Emperor supposedly using his Guardian Spear to signal the attack. Quite what killed Malak is not recorded by history, nor is the date that it happened, but he is recorded as the first custodian to die. Well, sort of, since he ended up in a dreadnought. He's not technically dead, but close enough. His contemptor was a standard prime pattern, armed with an assault cannon and a plasma gun-mounted power fist, and the Emperor is said to have carved the now iconic phrase, "Only in death does duty end," onto his hull. I'm aware the Space Marines stole the phrase, but it's more of a dreadnought associated line to my mind, and this would possibly explain why. We do not know how many battles the now dreadnought Malak saw during his time, but eventually he retreated into the sleep commonly associated with older dreadnoughts. However, he was forcibly awoken at one point as part of the war in the Webway during the Horus Heresy. In the battles with the demonic forces invading the damaged Imperial Webway, he was still shown great respect by other custodians, some of whom probably had served with him in life since they're biologically immortal, as he was given a measure of command as well. He did battle with the corrupted avatar of the Mechanicum's Unmaker god, known as the Archimandrite, during the battle. He suffered heavy damage, but he was bailed out by the famous Magos Archenland, whose name is also used to credit the Land Raider and Land Speeder, before being destroyed. We haven't heard of his deeds since the battle, but I assume he spent the time since the return of Robert Gilliman asleep, since the Custodes were mostly just on housekeeping duty between the Heresy's End and that point, but now they're back on the move and we haven't heard of him, so I assume he's still having a big long nap. As you might expect, given its forces were once Imperial, Chaos Space Marines have dreadnoughts just like their loyalist counterparts do. However, the traitor Astartes are loath to be interred into one even beyond the loyalists, viewing it as a fate worse than death itself, which you might guess is no surprise given what the warp often does to mechanical constructs. As a result, being made into a dreadnought is used as a punishment by Chaos Lords, but the amount of chassis available is probably much lower in a warband of the Traitor Legions or Chaos Renegades than in a Loyalist chapter. This is primarily because, just like the Adeptus Mechanicus for the most part, the method of dreadnought construction has been lost amongst Chaos forces. They can't even build a commonplace Imperial Castaferum, never mind Contemptors, Leviathans, or things like that. That said, there is one type of dreadnought that can be built by Warpsmiths, the Dark Mechanicum, and so on. Hellbrutes. These are insane, twisted, and corrupted dreadnoughts where the unfortunate pilot has melded with the mechanical parts. There are no demons involved, but the new armors that are constructed are instead given a parasitic sarcophagus to ensure this fusion occurs. You maybe now can see why being made into a dreadnought, especially with the increasing frequency of Hellbrutes, is considered a punishment as opposed to anything else. Interestingly, unlike many dreadnoughts, Hellbrutes do not sleep between battles or after a certain amount of time, assuming they live that long. The insane hatred and desperation of the pilot means that it is possibly unable to do so, and will instead attack anything it can, allies very much included. As a result, something else I think is unique to Hellbrutes is done between battles, as the pilots are extracted from the machine and left inert somewhere, presumably in a box, whilst the machine itself is chained down in case any residue of the pilot's soul, spirit, something, sends it into a frenzy. When it's time to go back to war, the weapons are prepared and the pilot is reinstalled before the Hellbrute is unleashed and hopefully pointed in the right direction. Despite the increasing prevalence of the Hellbrutes in Chaos forces, there are still variants of the original Imperial ones. For example, the Ferris Infernum Dreadnought is the Chaos equivalent to the Imperial Castaferum, all of whom are Heresy-era relics by this point, and who, sometimes at least, have retained their sense and sanity a lot better than their compatriots. That's not to say that many Ferris Infernum Dreadnoughts are not insane, but that happens to Castaferums as well, and those who are still in control are probably invaluable commanders and advisors due to having millennia of experience. Unsurprisingly though, the Chaos Gods could not simply allow the Dreadnoughts to just exist, and many warbands have created variants dedicated to their chosen deity. For example, the Ferris Infernum has a Slaneshi variant, known as the Sonic Dreadnought. This unsurprisingly uses the sonic weaponry made famous amongst the Noise Marines and the Emperor's Children, but the choice of implantation into one is not that simple. Typical Sonic Dreadnought pilots are Noise Marines, which is perhaps no surprise, but the internment process causes a total sensory cutoff for the pilot, or at least a massive sensory deprivation. Given the ever-present desire/need of Noise Marines to seek the greatest sensory excess possible, this cutoff, this starvation of excess, will eventually drive them insane unless they have a lot of control. Insane Sonic Dreadnoughts probably need to be treated in a similar manner to Hellbrutes, just in case, because I don't think a Doom Siren going off in the middle of a ship is a good idea. Interestingly, there is actually a pattern of Chaos Dreadnought that is not considered a punishment to be interred into, the Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought. This, and the fact that it's stupid rare because it's a contemptor for chaos, means that it's basically impossible to be interred into one unless you happen to be a Chaos Lord yourself, which also presumably means that even if they weren't chaos and exceptionally needed for that job, they're very rare. I wouldn't be surprised if many of them have been lost to sabotage over the millennia from spiteful associates and underlings. Chaos Contemptors are also, relatively speaking, safe from the greatest weakness to my mind of all Dreadnoughts, particularly Chaos ones: insanity. Though those capable of doing so are few and far between, there are Warpsmiths and Dark Mechanicum members with the knowledge and skill to properly maintain these ancient machines and keep them in working order without damaging the body or the mind of the pilot who is or was probably also the boss of said individual. Though of course, because it's chaos, someone had the bright idea of seeing what happens when you mix a demon and a dreadnought. No prizes for guessing who was responsible for that one, especially considering it was in the Horus Heresy. Yep, the Word Bearers decided to try and use one of their fallen Galvor back in combination with a Contemptor Dreadnought, and the result was first encountered during the Battle of Calth and known as a Mara Gal Tainted Dreadnought. This fusion of possessed warrior and machine was apparently a nightmare to face, armed with warp fire spewing weapons and supposedly even able to phase through obstacles. Luckily, I have no modern records of the Blighter, which may mean the art of their creation has been lost. Oh, I so hope it has. Whilst we're on Contemptors, there is another God-aligned Dreadnought that at least originated from Contemptors, the Cornate Berserker Dreadnought. Unsurprisingly, this was first found within the Khorne-aligned World Eaters Legion, supposedly during the Horus Heresy, with higher speed and melee potential than their contemporaries. Usually used as suicidal line breakers, showing exactly how much value Angron placed on Dreadnoughts, it is speculated by some that the Berserker Dreadnoughts were first created and used before the Heresy, and thus in the Great Crusade, before the World Eaters fell into the service of Khorne. Given they were extensively using the Butcher's Nails in the Crusade as a result of Angron, it would not surprise me if there were pre-Heresy World Eater Dreadnought pilots who exhibited very berserk behaviour, and it would certainly feed into the reputation of the 12th as bloodthirsty killers. But I cannot confirm either way whether they were first seen in the Crusade or the Heresy, and whether you class the Crusade era ones as berserker, it's a little bit hazy. As for the other gods, we don't know of any Tzeentchian Dreadnoughts in particular unless you count the Osirans of the pre-Heresy Thousand Sons, but Nurgle has one, and unsurprisingly for the Plague Father, it's based on the toughest and bulkiest of them all. This is the Hell-Forged Leviathan Dreadnought, and if our previous log gave you any indication about how tough it is to deal with a standard one, then that has nothing on this brute. Armed with a vast array of ranged or melee weapons, the corruption of Nurgle that permeates this dreadnought allows it to heal off damage by drawing energy from those it kills. Given it's stupid bulky anyway because it's a Leviathan and it's Nurgly, I really don't want to know how much it takes to put one down even before it gets around to killing something. Finally, though it isn't a dreadnought per se, I did want to talk about something speculated as a replacement for them amongst the traitor legions, the Decimator Demon Engine. It is a towering machine that dwarfs even the Contemptor Dreadnoughts, yet it is armed in a manner similar to them or Leviathans, as opposed to having more demonic weapons as you'd expect it to have as a demon engine. Believed first encountered in late M35, its creator is unknown, but it is a speculated hybrid of human, demon, and Xenos technology. And whilst it is believed a rare creation, it is not one I want to run across anytime soon. The final race known to extensively use dreadnought technology, though not quite in the same manner as the Astartes, is the Orcs. I don't count Eldari Wraith's construct since they use the souls of the dead as opposed to the bodies of the living as pilots. There are 3 exceptionally broad classes of dreadnoughts in Orcdom as far as I'm aware. In ascending order of size and status, they are the Killicans, the Death Dreads, and the Mega Dreads. Killicans we actually mentioned briefly in our recent log on Gretchen, as they are essentially grot-piloted mini-dreadnoughts created by the collaboration of Mech Boys and Pain Boys. However, the right to be interred into a Killican is not one reserved for the near-dead. Grots probably don't survive long enough after a crippling injury for that to work as a system. Instead, it is a desire of many Gretchen to be permanently hardwired into the new metal killbot once the Mech Boys have finished it, partly for power, but also for payback against those who up until then had been untouchable oppressors. Though they find it hilarious and celebrate it when they're not on the receiving end, the Orcs had best be wary of a newly created Killican's mad rampage, particularly if they picked on the new Grot pilot or just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Armed with a reasonably powerful melee weapon known as a can claw and a gun usually left for elite Orc infantry, the cans, when not kept in pens for everyone's safety, are indeed a potent weapon. But at the end of the day, they are still Gretchen. This means that they get cowed rather easily, and though they often work in squadrons or try to stick close to Death Dreads as reassurance, it is not unheard of them for just wandering off in Terra halfway through a battle. It's hilarious and also probably quite embarrassing. The same cannot be said, however, for Death Dreads, probably the closest in size to classic dreadnoughts, though they do tote many more big weapons. As with Killicans, the pilot is hardwired into the machine by the Pain Boys and the Mech Boys and can never leave once they've been implanted. But this time the pilot isn't a cowardly grot, but a battle-hardened Orc. Granted, the Orcs typically do not share the same enthusiasm for this as the Grots do, because becoming a Death Dread for them is much more of a trade-off. You get raw killing power and more DACA at a cost of living in a massive tin can, eating your meals through a straw, and seeing the world through a tiny vision slit for the rest of your days. Plus, we all know that Pain Boys are not exactly renowned for good surgical practice, so it's going to be one heck of a mess of an implantation procedure, to put it lightly. But it works, and it makes for an utterly deadly machine. 2 or more massive melee weapons, loud DACA-spewing guns, and at least enough armour that stops it being an easy thing to take down. Typically, war bosses will deploy their Death Dreads sparingly, mostly because they're stupidly expensive to commission and create. But when used to support the boss and his nobs, or bolster a charging battle line, they can be crucial assets for any war. Admittedly, this limited use is a source of annoyance for Death Dread pilots. Unlike Space Marines, the Orcs don't have a stasis system, so can't really go to sleep between battles, which means they get bored. Really bored. The upside to this is that when they are unleashed, you can all but guarantee they'll go on a massive killing spree against the enemies of Orcdom. To be honest, part of me wonders how they're kept from slaughtering their own like the Killicans do when they're built, but I suppose they value being alive enough to crump stuff to not do that. I can't recall a particularly famous named Death Dread, but there is an infamous one, though it isn't named, if you're a big fan of a certain Pain Boy. After all, it was a Death Dread that caused the massive cranial injuries to Mad Doc Grotznick that had to be patched up by his Grot orderlies. The Doc had been called in to look at a supposedly faulty Dread by the knobs he'd given the Gazcall special to in the past, but there was no fault. It was a trap that saw the Dread carve Grotznick's head open with its buzzsaw. Ow. And then, finally, you have the Mega Dreads. These are, for most mech boys, the biggest and best things that they can create, and they're even able to be shut down between battles for safety thanks to removable neural implants. I use that term in air quotes because said implantation involves a hammer and removal requires a crowbar. They are unsurprisingly one of the most expensive things that Teeth can buy, but they are undoubtedly worthwhile to acquire when possible. And should a wire be particularly mechanical in nature, there's also a variant known as the Mecha Dread that trades guns, or at least some of them, for repair tools that can keep itself and possibly other vehicles in good working order. There are other Orc walkers, notably the Gorkanaut, Morkanaut, and Stomper, and then the Gargant, but since they're piloted by just regular Orcs, they're not hardwired in, they have the option to leave. I don't count them as Dreadnoughts, so we won't be discussing them here. And there you have it, an update on the various Dreadnoughts found outside the loyalist Adeptus Astartes. Honestly, there are other analogues across the galaxy if you stretch things far enough. The Parasite Enclaves, for example, have converted a Crisis Battlesuit in a life support system. Just take Chasso Bravestorm. But whether among the Adeptus Custodes, the Chaos Space Marines, the Orcs, or anyone else you choose to count, these engines of war reinforce the deserved reputation of Dreadnoughts as deadly tools in a commander's arsenal. For now though, we must move on to a new topic. Earlier I decided to make an exemption for a certain construct being classified as a Dreadnought, despite some surface similarities between them. I stand by that exemption, but it got me thinking about the idea of those things in general, and whilst I don't know how much information I'll find, I want to research them further. So that's the plan going forward. For now, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.